Even before it was released, Nightreign evoked an important question from Elden Ring lore fans. Namely, what is going on? With trailers revealing that Dark Souls bosses would appear, and interviews with the director talking in circles about how the story might relate to Elden Ring, most players concluded that Nightreign was simply not part of the canon story. Since the game's release, that conclusion has gotten more and more murky. So it's time to confront the story of Nightreign on its own terms, and see if we can find the ever-elusive pull between meanings. So, as usual, this video will contain spoilers, but more than ever, that's a strange disclaimer to give, because you can get through all of Nightreign and barely detect that there even is a story to spoil. Clearly, this is a title that was designed first and foremost as a gameplay experience, which is unsurprising, given that director Junya Ishizaki's previous role in Elden Ring was to design its combat. But if you keep digging, there is a story in Nightreign, primarily told through the gradually recalled memories of the Nightfarers. There are already a couple of decent overviews of the various Remembrance storylines on YouTube, so I'm not going to spend time summarizing the plot, though I will mention relevant lore as it comes up. I am more of a big picture person, so what I'm looking for are the threads that connect those tidbits of story together, and we have just enough loose, dangling threads to start tugging. The first thing we need to consider is how to frame the story we're uncovering, because there's an understanding that has already become standard in the lore community that needs to be unraveled before we can start to weave a new interpretation. When Nightreign was first announced, many lore fans were excited, but unsure how it would connect to the lore of Elden Ring. The director gave several interviews on the topic, including the following quote: "We'd like fans to think of Nightreign as an Elden Ring spin-off, first and foremost. The story is completely separate and parallel to the world of Elden Rings. If you had to tie it in some way, we had the events of the Shattering in the original game. After the events of the Shattering, this is a completely separate branch of the Elden Ring story." This note that the story diverges after the Shattering led to a pretty natural expectation for the story of Nightreign. It was an alternate history of the Lands Between, a what-if scenario, where events were largely similar until the Shattering, and then diverged dramatically. Presumably, we would be trying to figure out what went differently in this alternate timeline that led to the catastrophic fall of night. It also meant that the story of Nightreign wouldn't directly relate to the story of Elden Ring, but that references to pre-Shattering events could at least help to flesh out some additional background for the Lands Between. So then the game released, and the story, frankly, doesn't seem to follow this alternate history concept at all. Or to put it another way, it's not clear what it would mean for Nightreign to be an alternate timeline, because it doesn't seem to present a sensical timeline itself. Rather, the game tells us, explicitly, that the Nightfarers are drawn not only from different lands and cultures, but different times, and brought together to confront the night. Similarly, the enemies that we fight seem to be drawn from different places, and even from wholly different worlds, which I think is how we're meant to interpret the occasional Dark Souls references. Even the Nightlord itself is a changeable, amorphous being. There's been some confusion among the English-speaking audience because of the seemingly interchangeable references to a Nightlord or the Nightlord. But one thing to keep in mind is that in Japanese, there are no definite and indefinite articles. So these two phrases in Japanese are just Yoru no O, Nightlord. The many Nightlords are also one unified thing, the Nightlord, which takes on many different forms, a fact reinforced by the final boss being able to shift and channel every possible element. I still have to fully review the Japanese text for the game, but this is one detail that warrants mentioning early. So rather than being one alternate timeline, the night can be understood as an amalgamation of all alternate timelines. Whether it makes more sense to call the night an outer god or a natural phenomenon, what it represents is the infinite sea of possibilities, vying for existence against a single, stable reality. And once we shift our conception of the story in this way, everything else starts to slowly click together. Thematically, light in Elden Ring has always been connected to order, and can even bind things together. So the night, representing an unraveling of the rules of reality, matches imagery and themes that have always been present. This also tells us why the story of Nightreign begins with a shattering. When the Elden Ring breaks, then the boundary lines around reality itself weaken, and otherworldly forces threaten to seep into the lands between. But perhaps the strongest reason for viewing Nightreign in this way is the ending. Upon defeating Hailstor, the primordial Nightlord, and giving his rune to a corpse, the Nightfarers turn into motes of golden light, and we are shown the lands between, the canonical lands between, complete with Erdtree. A titanic figure rises from the sea and walks away from the Erdtree, leaving the canon lands between intact. The natural reading of this ending is that the events of Nightreign, in some fashion, were happening alongside the canon story of Elden Ring the entire time. We have been engaged in a metaphysical battle outside of the familiar world, and our reward for victory is returning to the lands between as we know it. This explains what Ishizaki means by saying that the story is separate and parallel to the story of Elden Ring. In a more recent follow-up interview, he said, Nightreign shares essentially the base setting and the world of Elden Ring, but it's played out on a different stage, so to speak. So what is this different stage that the story takes place in? What is the nature of this metaphysical battle that the Nightfarers are engaged in? There's an idea that I've heard fairly often about Elden Ring, and which has surfaced in the comments on my other videos, that the entirety of the lands between is a kind of purgatory, a land between life and death. I've always thought that this idea was evocative and interesting, but there's simply not much evidence for it in the base game of Elden Ring. If we were supposed to read the lands between as purgatory, then I would expect to encounter more language about the idea of redemption, about breaking free of the cycle we're trapped in, and some kind of reference to a past life that we struggle to remember. But we don't get any of that. Well, if you've played Nightreign...
Seekers of redemption. Condemned, I welcome you to the Round Table Hold, and your memories will be the key.
You know that this is a game that has this language and imagery in spades. The entire game revolves around the condemned, our playable characters, trying to atone for some past sin by overcoming the night, so that they can pass on from this existence to something else. It's not immediately obvious if we're dead, alive, or something in between. In fact, Wilder's story makes a big deal of the fact that the priestess will be unable to return to the world after defeating the Nightlord, implying, by contrast, that everyone else will be able to return to their normal lives after the credits roll. But if we complete the other Remembrance storylines, we find more and more caveats. Wilder himself is said to be suffering from mortal injuries outside of the Round Table Hold. Iron Eye is revealed to be one of those who live in death in his storyline. Executor's story ends with a memory of him committing seppuku. The Revenant was never alive to begin with. She's literally a doll that became animated to avenge her owner's death. So, with more than half of the cast eventually confirmed to be some variety of dead or dying, it's reasonable to start thinking of this space that we're in as connected to the boundary between life and death, and the remaining stories can also be viewed through this lens. Guardian's story is about learning the source of the curse that felled his people, and while it claims that he was the only survivor of the war, the story makes just as much sense if he died with the singular regret that he failed to save his people, a regret that he carries with him as a Nightfarer. The same is true of Raider. If he passed away before he could make it to the promised duel with his nemesis, it would make sense that his soul would be haunted by the task left undone. And every character is haunted in a similar way. They are seeking atonement twice over, once for some great, singular sin that their ancestors share, which we'll discuss later, and again for their own personal failing, which prevents them from being able to find peace. The majority of the game's actual story is about the individual Nightfarers confronting their most painful memories and failings. And there's another specific theme that frames these various stories: loss of identity. This comes firstly from the fact that the Nightfarers have each forgotten their own past, or even their names. Thus, they are instead called by titles. But identity is even more directly broached in many of their specific storylines. The Executor may be the best example. His journal entries are written like poems, with an unclear perspective that blurs lines of self-description. "I am a painter," he says in one entry, and then, "I am a guest," or perhaps an executioner. At the end of his questline, we find the scene that he has been repressing from his memory: a shack in the Altus Plateau, an unfinished painting outside, a dead woman, and a crucible knight that cannot bear to remain. The Executor we know has taken on the identity of the fallen painter as part of his own. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that the Executor is more than one person, both the painter and the executioner combined. The unfinished Erd Tree painting haunts this Nightfarer, the thing left undone that embodies their regret. And we see this theme of mixed identity reoccur. The Raider has taken on the mantle of White Horn and forgotten that he is actually the Black Claw. The Revenant initially believes that she is a young noble trapped in the body of a doll, but eventually remembers that she is the doll itself. Now consider the Iron Eye, who faces another assassin that cannot die in the middle of his questline. This other assassin serves narratively as a mirror to the Iron Eye himself, but in the context of this recurring theme, might also be a literal reflection of the Iron Eye confronting a fact about himself. How about Recluse? She says that she gave her child to the Witch of the Wheel, and when we encounter this witch, she looks identical to the Recluse herself. There are several ways of explaining this, but again, given the repeating pattern, it's possible that this other witch is simply an aspect of herself, the externalized part of her past that she hasn't come to terms with yet. For each of these Nightfarers, fighting against the night is as much a personal struggle to fight for their own memories and identities as it is a fight against an otherworldly force. The night blurs the boundaries around everything it touches, and just as separate worlds blend together to create Limveld, so too do our Nightfarers start to have the various features of their backstories merge into their bodies and minds to gradually erode their previous sense of self. If all this talk about mixing identities and breaking down the boundaries of individuality sounds familiar, it might be because it's a recurring theme within Elden Ring, one that I discuss extensively in my Grand Unified Theory episodes. Not only is Marika herself a combined being with Radagon, but the merging of individuals into a whole is a theme that appears in the Frenzied Flame storyline, in Selin's questline, and the jarring ritual of the horn scent. This theme's return signals that, in its own subtle ways, Nightreign is building upon established elements of Elden Ring's world. And with these themes in mind, we can turn to the various aspects of the Nightlord itself. I mentioned that the distinction between a Nightlord and the Nightlord is murky. These are aspects of a single thing, the night, which has a limitless reach and immeasurable potential. But among this infinite sea of possibility that the night represents, there is a pattern in the form of the Nightlords. They each have a fixation, a need, a feeling that consumes them. It's tempting, given the fact that there are 7 Nightlords leading up to the primordial Nightlord, to see them as representations of the 7 deadly sins. Some of them align pretty well with this sort of formulation, as you have wrath, gluttony, sloth, and greed pretty clearly represented. I'm not sure that all of the sins align well, and trying too hard to figure out which one represents lust is not something I'm going to go deeper into in this video, for reasons. But assigning each of the traditional deadly sins isn't really the point. The point is that this kind of classification is tempting because the Nightlords aesthetically and thematically evoke feelings of absence, concepts like anger, loneliness, and hunger. Even their backstories don't really communicate the idea of triumphantly ascending to lordship. Rather, they each have something that they are missing, something that they lose, and that loss becomes embodied and manifested as the Nightlord we face. If we are reading this as a metaphysical battlefield, then they each represent a different way that you can lose yourself to the night. Which raises another interesting mirror of the Nightlords. Are Nightfarers. There are 8 of each, and one that stands apart as the anchor for the others. The Priestess is our anchor, and Hailstore is the Knight's anchor. And there are 8 graves in the crypt below, the graves of our ancestors who could not overcome the night on their own. It's hard to know exactly what to make of this parallel, and trying to assign specific Nightlords to specific Nightfarers is going to get us off topic, though you're welcome to give it a try yourself. The real point I'm working toward is mirroring. 8 Nightfarers must confront 8 Nightlords. This wasn't a pre-existing fact at the beginning of the game, but a fact that emerges after defeating Tricephalos, almost as though the night is responding to our progress by proliferating its many forms. And speaking of Tricephalos, this first boss is a fitting design for a boundary guardian who must be overcome before descending further into the game, as he is clearly modeled after Cerberus, the 3-headed hound that guards the gate of the underworld in Greek mythology. But mirroring. The sense that we gradually gain is that the night presents a sort of natural opposite to light and order. Consider the bone-like stone, found during the Recluse's story. It says that it is the bone of an outer god, with the power to expunge divine essence, but that can also be destroyed by the same essence. It also says that it has a distinct lifelessness, which is a bizarre phrase that I love, honestly. This description gives the item a quality almost like antimatter, a reflection and opposite of the energy of gold, and it's evocative of the Fingerslayer blade from Elden Ring, a weapon that says it was created from a corpse and has the power to harm the Greater Will and its vassals. I don't want to get too sidetracked by that, but it's an interesting connection. So, with this mirroring theme in mind, consider the primordial Nightlord's rune, which is a thing with the properties of a great rune, harbored by the primordial Nightlord. Note the peculiar wording. It's not a great rune. It's a thing similar to a great rune, a reflection of one. Now look at its shape. There are various things we could say about it, but the most important thing is that at the base of this dark circle, there's a faint golden arc with a line coming down from it, much like Marika's rune, found at the top of the Elden Ring. Indeed, many people, myself included, have noted that the arc is by its nature part of an implied greater whole, and this arc is connected to a greater whole, a dark circle which is hidden away inside the Nightlord. This is, after all, what Hailstore means. In Old English, it can mean darkness, or a hiding place. I noticed that Nameless Singer made a similar connection, and says that it's related to the modern word holster, which seems quite apt to me. When we confront the primordial Nightlord, he is initially shown wrapped in bandages, which are in turn covered in a golden script. We can find a match for these bindings in the Vestige of Night item, which says, "The hint of an impression, once made by the engraving of an old sealing stone, can be seen, but it is no longer legible." So the golden script is a seal placed upon a body that was wrapped and preserved, almost evoking mummification. This creature is called the Shape of Night, and it is in the shape of a person, bound and repressed. I'm sure tarnished archaeologists will think that the Nightlord emerging from a preserved corpse is a relevant detail, but we have other points to make for now. As the fight progresses, the Nightlord's bindings come loose and allow him to draw additional weapons. In Phase 2, his bindings are gone, and Hailstore has the ability to call upon all of the aspects of night we have faced so far. He cuts reality asunder and embodies flame, thunder, and madness. And we can see the Nightlord's rune embedded within his frame, a hiding place. For all his terrifying strength, Hailstore is ultimately a vessel that contains a secret. The secret of the Erd Tree's sin. Within the crypt, underneath the round table, we can find a plaque which reads, "To atone for the first sin, we elect to become the foundation." There is some great sin that the cutting-gifted tribe is trying to make amends for, connected to the night. After finding the Nightlord's rune, we learn that this great sin is the sin of the Erd Tree. This language about an original sin has been an open question in the Elden Ring lore community for some time, and Nightreign seems to be confirming that the sin at the center of its story is the same as the one we have been wondering after. To make sense of this, let's back up and think about the larger themes present here. Nightreign is, obviously, all about the night, but the balance of day and night, and the way that the light of the Erd Tree has altered this balance, is a theme present throughout Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erd Tree. For instance, here's a quick quote about the thematics of the night from one wise and insightful YouTuber. "When the orthodox light of the world dims, we start to see things that were suppressed by it. Deathbirds and bell-bearing hunters can enter our world, and when we look up, we can see the night sky, a myriad of lights that are not the sun, a veritable sea of possibilities. The night has always represented possibilities drowned out by the golden light of the Erd Tree. Indeed, there's an argument to be made that the Erd Tree literally contains the light of the sun within it, which I mentioned in this video. This may seem like some indulgent self-promotion, but the point I'm getting at is that these themes aren't new, and the fact that Nightreign is referring to the same thematic underpinnings of Elden Ring's story is a solid point in favor of thinking that it is expanding on the same story. This theme is about a past, multifaceted divinity being suppressed to privilege a single, stable divinity. The light of the sun and the light of the Erd Tree privilege the very existence of some aspects of reality, while casting others into shadow, or leaving them obscured within the night. With this in mind, let's look again at the shape of the Nightlord's rune. I said that it has a shape like Marika's rune at its base. Now, obviously, there are some extra scratches across the bottom, and you might think that's enough to make it a different rune. This is particularly notable during the final battle, where the rune visible within the Nightlord has these scratches extended into a series of disordered arcs. However, when we collect the rune and offer it during the standard ending, those arcs have dissipated, and this is what the rune looks like. I think the prominence of the core shape of Marika's rune here isn't a coincidence. So if this is Marika's rune, I think we can read this in two different ways. On the one hand, Marika's rune could be acting like a seal upon the Nightlord, just as her rune functions as a seal over Mesmer's eye, locking away the abyssal serpent. Alternatively, it could be that Marika's rune was always part of a larger circular rune, the rest of which we can no longer see. This, in turn, implies that all of the arcs of the Elden Ring are incomplete, that its entire shape is a portion of a greater whole that has become invisible, as a single reality has been chosen from the myriad of possible worlds, and is suppressing all other possibilities. The shape of this Nightlord's rune is an impression left behind when a great rune of light was formed, a dark mirror of the radiant Elden Ring. And this, I think, is directly connected to the original sin. We can better understand this sin by considering its consequences. The thing hidden and sealed away inside of Hailstore slowly festers in resentment for untold ages, and now threatens to burst forth from its containment and undo the world as we know it. The consequence is the looming of a cataclysmic night, and thus the original sin must be connected to it. We know that night isn't inherently cruel or wrong, but that it responds to the way it is perceived. The Night Shard item says, whether one fears the night or welcomes it depends upon the manner of contact. Indeed, the Recluse's ending, possibly the most hopeful ending within Elden Ring's extended story, is for her to embrace the night that is her own child and show it love. We can only imagine how different Mesmer's story might be if he were ever shown such tenderness. While we cannot know for sure what the world looked like before the Erd Tree, we do know that the Erd Tree replaced and suppressed a very different world. The primordial form of the Erd Tree was destroyed. Whole civilizations were hidden away in darkness, and many outer gods were sealed away to construct a monotheistic, monolithic culture for the lands between. Perhaps the sealing away of night is at the very heart of this great sin, or perhaps it is only one aspect of what transpired when the Erd Tree was born. That leaves us with the question of the cutting-gifted tribe, those who carry guilt connected to this sin. While the identity of this tribe requires some speculation, we have a few clues. First, the phrase cutting-gifted is evocative of the same plant cutting and grafting terminology and imagery we've seen in Elden Ring. Second, the crypt tells us that the ways of cutting point to the deep woods, and then that the ways of cutting point to Windwale Knoll. These are the origins of the Recluse and the Wilder, respectively. But more importantly, what is being described is a diaspora event. The cutting-gifted tribe was once a single group, and they spread out and diversified over the ages. At the moment, I think our best bet for the identity of the cutting-gifted tribe is the Numen. It's always struck me that both the Nox and the Shamans are suggested to be Numen, but have radically different cultures. I don't think that's a contradiction, but a hint about the deep history of this world. The Numen were an ancient people, possibly some of the first people in Elden Ring's world, and at some point, possibly after the fall of Rao, they splintered and spread to different parts of the world. The many distant descendants of the Numen, all carrying a shared sense of responsibility for the great sin that underlies America's godhood, makes a certain amount of sense. So, with all of that in mind, let's finally address what is actually happening in the story when we confront and defeat the Nightlord. At this point, we have a great many hints about the nature of the Nightlord. We know that night itself is neither malicious nor benign, but like all of the outer gods, takes on a differing aspect with how it is perceived. Now, consider the description of Hailstor's relic. The country lay in ruin. The man who once was knight had challenged the hero, but he too was no match. He fell, just another body in a great pile. But eventually, he awoke, crawling out from underneath the others. Though he had failed to protect anything or anyone, he yet lived. And so, he cursed the world. Now, we could speculate about the identity of the knight and the hero, but that's not the part that really matters in my mind. What I notice is the framing of everything else. We aren't given a name. Indeed, the key characteristic of this knight is that he isn't special, that he is just another body in a pile. We said before that the loss of individual identity is a consequence of surrendering to the night, and Hailstor is the very embodiment of this fate. In fact, this image of a pile of bodies from which a singular being emerges directly evokes the unity and division theme I referenced earlier. Like the jarring ritual, like the divine gate, or like the god-devouring serpent, many individuals giving up their separate identities to become one takes mortals a step closer to the divine in the world of Elden Ring. And some form of this has occurred, whether by intention or accident, to create the entity we call Hailstor. So this battle we engage in is a battle between divine forces. To overcome the night and bring dawn, we must take the very essence of the night and cheat a god. We cannot destroy the night. It is a force of nature. What we can do is take the connection between the mortal world and the repressed divine, the Nightlord's room, and lock it away within a new vessel. This is what we are doing at the end of the game. This corpse was prepared to be a new cage for the aspects of the world that the Golden Order cannot coexist with. Perhaps it has some special property that will keep the night contained. Or perhaps this is simply a way of delaying the inevitable, and yet another corpse must be offered in time. Perhaps we must continue offering up our humanity time and again to keep darkness sealed away. How very FromSoft that would be. And now I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb. Bestow me a branch, and I will wander and roam about the speculation knoll. So I've said that Nightreign may be taking place alongside the canon world of Elden Ring, but this leaves a question. When is this taking place? The standard ending shows us the lands between as we are used to seeing it, after the shattering, but before the Erdtree burns. However, Nightreign brings our attention, repeatedly, to the fact that time doesn't work normally within the realm we explore. The Nightfarers are drawn from different times and places, and the Duchess, who is also our priestess, carries a pocket watch that is implied to be able to rewind time, the sense that this game gives us is that time doesn't progress in a linear fashion, but a circular one. And this leads me to keep thinking about the title of the ending. Dawn, the inevitable consequence of defeating the night. I think of Aztec ritual sacrifice, seen as necessary to ensure that the sun would keep rising. And I wonder if this metaphysical struggle we are engaged in isn't happening once, but repeatedly. After all, both Elden Ring and Nightreign make a habit of merging literal and metaphorical meanings. We are battling, quite literally, the night, the same night that falls upon the world at the end of each day. So I like to imagine that what we are actually seeing within Nightreign is a battle stretched across time, at least for the duration of the dwindling order that follows the shattering. Once the Elden Ring shatters, the radiant golden seals upon the night weaken, and the pact made by the cutting-gifted tribe draws Nightfarers together, not once, but each and every day, to struggle against eternity and ensure that the dawn will come one more time. The sun rises over the lands between, because in the shrouded places of the world, there is a sacrifice made, sufficient to quell the ever-looming darkness of the unknowable. And once we assure that the sun will rise, we become light to join in its ascent over the realm. At least, that's how I like to think about it. Honestly, I can't believe I went this deep, this early into the existence of Nightreign. We're in such early days that even the wikis didn't have proper descriptions for half of the items in the game as I wrote this. Of course, several other channels have put out videos just in the time that it took me to edit this video together, and our understanding as a community will likely evolve over time. So it's important to note that this video is one interpretation of Nightreign. There clearly are elements of the game that we are intended to read as being non-canon or minimally canon, but there's still more than enough here for us to chew on and digest in the context of greater Elden Ring lore. So, if you were worried that I had given up on making Elden Ring content, or had run out of things to say, I suspect this video speaks for itself. I'm nowhere close to running out of things to say about Elden Ring, but I do intend to keep expanding my channel and talking about, well, whatever I'm inspired by. This will double as a way to make sure that I am fully digesting ideas, rather than spitting out endless Elden Ring videos just because I can. I plan to keep coming back, and keep providing a lens on the lore that is unique, and hopefully enriches your ability to engage with it yourself. I was originally going to mention some of my complicated thoughts on Nightrein's actual design, on its strengths and its quirks, but I decided that was outside the scope of this video. I also wanted to go into the contrast between night and shadow, and determine if they were the same thing or very different. Spoiler, I think they're different. If you want to hear those thoughts whenever I get around to making those videos, you probably already know what to do. While you're at it, leave a like and a comment, and make sure the algorithm knows that this is some engaging content. Until next time.